All right, I wanted to welcome everyone here today. Not only do we celebrate Women's History Month in March, but we also acknowledge and celebrate Week of Solidarity with people struggling against racism and racial discrimination. It actually begins this week, 21st to the 27th. In 1979, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a program of activities to be undertaken during the second half of the decade for action to combat racism and racial discrimination. On that occasion, General Assembly decided that a week of solidarity with people struggling against racism and racial discrimination beginning on March 21st will be organized annually in all states. So I can't think of a better speaker than speaking on topics of trauma, whether dealing with racial discrimination or just trauma in general. I've known today's speaker for many years, and I'm constantly in awe of her accomplishments and community outreach. Dr. Rosalyn Y. Brown Beatty is the director and full-time core faculty member in the Masters of Arts program in Clinical Mental Health Counseling at Union Institute and University. Dr. Brown Beatty is also the owner and head clinician at Brown Beatty Counseling and Consulting, LLC, mental health private practice in Cincinnati, Ohio. Academically, she has had the opportunity to educate students for 15 years on undergraduate, master's, and doctoral level at various universities via traditional on-campus classes and innovative online learning environments. Dr. Brown Beatty's experience includes teaching students enrolled in substance abuse counseling, clinical mental health counseling, school counseling, and counselor education and supervision programs. A highlight of her teaching experiences include courses in abnormal behavior, social basis of cultural diversity, stress management, career and life planning, and advanced doctoral seminar, counseling techniques, and clinical practicum and internship. Along with her academic instruction experience, Dr. Brown Beatty has experience working with the mental health and social service field for over 22 years. Specifically, she has experience working with adults healing from trauma, transforming generational trauma, adults in transition, caregivers, grief counseling, trauma work, and wounded healers and clinicians seeking therapy. Title of today's program is Generational Trauma. It may not have started with you, but it stops with you, healing our ancestral wounds. Without further ado, Dr. Rosalyn Brown Beatty.
Thank you. And sometimes listening to an introduction of yourself is sort of like when someone's singing happy birthday and you don't know what to do. And so he's going over all of this information. I'm like, oh, wow, that's me. That's pretty amazing for only being 21. And so I am super excited to speak with you all today. If you can, nudge, if you feel comfortable, me seeing your face would also be great. And only for the reason is that I'm a counselor. So I like to see facial expressions. I like to see if I'm hitting the mark, if I'm not. But if you're unable to, that is understandable. But I do love to be able to see faces, especially because I need to know when my jokes land. And so, as Tony mentioned, I got a whole bunch of stuff and some letters behind my name that give kind of like the qualifications to be able to speak about this. But this is actually a topic that is just near and dear to my heart. When I think about trauma, I think it is something that is missed about how much we are going through, not only a traumatic time now, but a traumatic time pre-COVID, and our parents and our grandparents and culturally, how that all impacts us mentally. So what I'm going to do today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the neuroscience and the epigenetics behind trauma, but then I'm really going to dig into this piece about, so now what do I do with this? And so my end goal is to convince you all that you are living a trauma-filled life and that you need to go to therapy, which everyone should go to therapy. And so just as a little bit of a background, I do not do a presentation like the PowerPoints because I want you to talk to me. I am used to being talked at because I'm a counselor. And so feel free to put questions in the chat box, throw up the little hand thing on Zoom, put up your physical hand, and let's be able to engage about this. And so trauma. We are all living in this stage of trauma, and we got to figure out, how do we live? How do we navigate our life and actually be happy. And so one of the things I want to talk to you about is inherited family trauma. I'll give some examples, but then also too, I make it very personable because then it also sticks out as well. And so there is a great book by Mark Rosalyn that talks about It Did Not Start With You. There also is a great book by Dr. Joy DeGruy that talks about post-traumatic slave syndrome. And then the last person that I really pull into from this is that there is a researcher, Rachel Yahuto, who does a lot of work on PTSD and how it is passed down in our epigenetics and how it is passed on through different generations. So let me first give the example of genetics and give that kind of brief description of it. And so epigenetics is thinking about, let's say that we have a twin. That would be amazing if I had a twin. And so when we look at having a twin, we know that they have all of the same DNA. So if you looked at my DNA, you looked at your twin's DNA, it's going to be the same. But the thing is with epigenetics is almost picture it like you've written a paragraph and it has all of these letters in it. Epigenetics means what happens in the mom system when they were pregnant with you, and even in the grandmother system, means that the lettering may be spaced a little bit different in the DNA. It doesn't change what the letters are, but it means that the spacing may be different. Why does that matter to us? The spacing in our DNA determines how we react to things. And so in the book, It Didn't Start With You, there's a great example of Jesse. Jesse is 19 years old and he's coming to counseling because he wants to die by suicide. He is struggling. And he said that, basically he's been going all of this time and he doesn't know why it's so full of fear of not wanting to be here. He mentioned that a few years previously, he woke up in the middle of the night about 3 a.m. and he was so cold. And when he was cold, he just kept thinking, if I go back to sleep, I'm going to die. No severe marked trauma in his history and finding out what was going on. So he just couldn't understand why this persistent feeling of not wanting to be here was here and feeling inside of him. So through his therapy with Mark, one of the things that he did was it's kind of like, tell me a little bit about your family's background. Have you had any family members that possibly wanted to die by suicide or died by suicide? And he said, no, I don't. I don't know where this is coming from. I came up, grew up with this happy life. I don't know where this is coming from. And so then doing a little bit of exploration with his mom, he found out about this uncle that he didn't know. This uncle that he didn't know actually died before he was born by being outside, and he was doing some work on some lines outside, but it was a blizzard during this time. He was looking for help. No one knew he was out there. By the time that he was found, it was the next day and he was found dead outside. And so when I heard this, I'm like, oh my gosh, like that's pretty deep. But then of course, as a counselor, you always got to find a way to how can I apply this to myself? Let me test this and see if this is true. And so here's a little bit of my story. And so I am a widow of 5 years. I have 2 little girls, and I am often known for speaking about grief and navigating widowhood. And I really felt like I am kicking widowhood's butt right now. I'm like, I got this. I'm helping other people through their grief. I'm navigating my grief. I'm navigating my kids' grief. I got this. And then we hit the 5-year marker. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this doesn't feel like grief. This almost feels like depression. But this, no, I do my work. I have a therapist. I got all these things. Why are things feeling so heavy for me right now? And so I'm going back, I'm like, okay, Rosalyn, let's do the work. Let's try to see, is this your trauma? And I'm like, are these any of my signs? Nope. Are things going good? Actually, yeah. But there is just this feeling of almost depression and feeling alone. And I couldn't shake that. And I didn't really want to even tell anybody that I was struggling, because it was just like, I feel completely and utterly alone. I know I got people there, but I still feel alone. And then as I'm like, even pulling up this stuff, which I'm just immersed in the things about trauma, I was like, I wonder what traumas my mother went through around this age. I was like, no, 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 no. This isn't really going to like apply to me in this way. So growing up, we had the picture perfect family. My mom, my dad, amazing role models in the community, active in the church, blah, blah, blah. Great presentation in front of people. But when I was younger, my dad struggled with alcoholism. We didn't really talk about it. It was just a part of life until he got in an accident. He hit someone else. He was pretty injured, and so was the person. He almost died multiple times on the operating table. And because of that, he spent 5 years in prison. And so something just told me, like, you know what? I'm feeling this feeling of being alone. Let me look a little bit deeper. Mom, how old were you when Dad went to jail? 39, 40. Oh, great. Like, okay. When did that happen? Yeah, it was about, I was 39, 40. And I remember I felt alone during it. Ooh, alone. When did that happen? Around December-ish of that year. So December also too was the 5-year anniversary of my husband dying. And here I am thinking that I'm navigating it, but here comes this core sentence, and we'll talk a little bit more about core sentences. If I kept saying, I feel like I'm alone. And that's the exact thing that my mom said. So then I was like, oh, great. Thanks, Mom. I have your trauma along with my own. And so thinking about this, one of the key things that we will talk about is that how sometimes the trauma that we have is not our own. Now, one of the things that Dr. Joy DeGruy talks a little bit about is with post-traumatic slave syndrome, to talk about how culturally we can have trauma passed down. And so when we think about enslaved peoples and the experiences that they had to go through, there was some cultural shaping, there was some shifting in the DNA, the epigenetics of how we respond to things. And so part of this process is not only going to be looking at, hey, what do our parents pass along, but also too, culturally what's passed along. And I'm gonna jump a little bit to the chat box, because Michael asks, does the anniversary or other markers play a role in this process? Yes, it does. And great question. Thank you for asking. There is another book called The Body Keeps Score. And so in our DNA is actually stored emotional memories. So think back a little bit of something like that may have been traumatic that happened to you. But then a certain time of year, you begin to think about, like, you know what? I'm feeling kind of down. I'm feeling a little bit sad. I'm feeling angry, but things are kind of going well. What's going on? The emotional DNA actually awakens during certain times of year to help protect you, quote unquote, to protect you in case something repeats. And so for me, in that example that I use, one, it was around the anniversary time of my husband's passing. And it also was around the time of my mother's traumatic history of also too with my dad not being there. Mind you too, I got 4 sisters. So it was 5 of us. My mom was left alone with 5 girls. So that's traumatic in itself. And so then you have that same time of year, my epigenetics, one, are naturally going to wake up for me, but with shared family trauma, it's going to awaken in myself as well. And you may ask kind of like, well, why? Why do we have this unlucky set of trauma that just passes on? Well, our brain's number one job is to help us to survive. And so emotional memory gets stored in our DNA because it thinks that if something else happens around this time of year, I need for my person to be ready. But this is imprinted, even going back, not just to our mothers, but also our grandmothers and grandfathers. And so let's say, for example, and I'm going to give another part too of kind of like my epigenetics. When my mom used to talk about her grandmother, one of the things that she always used to share was that she was mean and she drank a lot. And that's what she was known for. And so me, I care all about family history. So I'm like, why was she mean? Like, why did she drink a lot? I don't know. That's just kind of like the way she was. So I decided to start looking like on ancestry.com because I wanted to create some lineage. And as I'm looking through the census and I'm noticing something about her grandmother, and it says that she was a widow. She also became a widow at the age of 34. When I looked at how many kids she had listed, she had 9 kids. I was like, I probably would drink and be mean too if I'm widow with 9 kids. I already know how I feel with 2, but 9, yeah, I'm going to drink and be mean too. This will make a difference when we talk about this a little bit later with understanding your history. And so knowing that with your grandmother, if there is a stressful time, if she's pregnant and she's pregnant with your mother or your father, that's actually imprinted on the cellular DNA up to early as 5 months pregnant, it's imprinted on the cellular DNA of that fetus that she's carrying. And then what we know also too is that with women, you are born with the amount of eggs that you are going to have. That's it. So even that cellular composition, you were in there. So if grandma is going through a traumatic, stressful time, it's getting imprinted on mom, it's getting imprinted on you. The same thing also happens with men, but as we know too, men aren't born with all of the sperm that they need. It regenerates. But that also means that the traumatic experiences can get imprinted on the DNA even sooner. So it may be a little bit more fresher. And so let's just say that you think that you are going through a really rough time because it's COVID and life has changed and you're navigating this and you don't know why you're stressed and you don't know why you're depressed. Well, guess what? It may not all begin with you. It may not all begin with you. And so Christy added a question. You speak of emotional memory. Does it also show in the muscle memory? Meaning there are physical symptoms prior to the emotional event or time period too. Great question, because I'm going to talk a little bit about the trauma brain and I'm going to give my hand brain. And so this is going to represent our brain. This right here, this is going to be the brain stem. And this is going to be the part of the brain that sends out all of the alerts to our body. So we don't have to say, heart, I need you to pump blood. Lungs, I need you to breathe. This is going to automatically do this for us. Thank goodness, right? Then we're going to get up to here. This is where our amygdala is. Our amygdala is also where our trauma brain is located. I like to call this our smoke detector. And so with this, also like right up underneath here, this also is that fight, flight, freeze response, fawn and flop too. And so what happens when the brain is in survival mode, our amygdala comes online and says that, you know what? I got to jump in and I got to do something because I'm worried about my person being able to survive physically or emotionally. And so let's say the smoke alarm is going off. My amygdala begins to say, hey, you know what? Get the fire hose, get the firemen and women, get the buckets of water, get everything, get the baking soda, all this stuff, because there is a threat this here. But first, how it lets me know is here. The brainstem also sends out an alert to muscle memories. And so we each have a sensitive spot in our body that receives an alert that says that, hey, my fire alarm is going to go off. But the thing is that when this responds to keep us safe, it's not thinking about the long-term effects. And so the smoke detector is going off. I'm going in with the fire hose, firemen, the extinguishers, the baking soda, but sometimes it's just a grilled cheese that needs to be put to the other side of the stove. We want this part of our brain to come online. This is the prefrontal cortex. This is the complex decision making. This also is our language center. So what happens is the smoke of life, but not only just for us and also for our parents, come and literally makes us flip our lid. But sometimes we don't realize until we look around the kitchen and say like, oh my gosh, I may have over responded and I just needed to take the grilled cheese off the stove. But now I got all this damage of the water hose and the extinguishers. How am I going to clean this up? Oh, by the way, sometimes there's people too that are sitting in that kitchen too. I didn't mean to respond this way. But this part of our brain, our trauma brain is saying that, you know what? I want my person to survive. But we often miss too when our body signals, the muscle memory is letting us know that we are in this stage. And the great thing of why we feel it in our body is because that flight, flight, freeze, flop, or fawn stage is located right behind here in our limbic system of the amygdala. So think about when you feel nervous, what do you do? Like, do you have a feeling that makes you like, oh my gosh, I feel this in my chest. I gotta go. I gotta respond. Oh my gosh, I feel this emotion in my stomach. I gotta freeze. We miss this. And so part of this process, one, begins with identifying your story, your parents' story, and your cultural story. So we got to identify what's your smoke. Because smoke is going to come up and make us flip our lid. And we don't want to respond from here. We want to acknowledge our feelings from here. But we want to respond from here, our complex decision making. And then also too, this is where our language center is online. And so now that I've convinced you that you all are living with trauma, not only your own and your parents, and that it's all in your DNA, in your body, what do we do with this? One, identifying what your smoke is. And so we have this great thing called a trauma timeline. where we begin to identify what are the traumatic things that happen in our lives that may make us flip our lid. And so when we're creating the trauma timeline, we are literally starting in utero. So if we have access to our mother and our fathers biologically, we're going to find out, how was your pregnancy with me? Was it a smooth pregnancy? Was it a difficult pregnancy? What was going on there? And if there is something that was stressful on our timeline, we're going to put it below the line. Then we're going to keep looking and saying, where were the other traumatic experiences that happened up into my life until this point that I could list below the timeline? Now, let me also give the disclaimer. This is great to go through with a licensed professional to do this, but these are parts of your healing that you can begin on your own, knowing your story. And so I'll take myself as an example. And so again, because we're going to get back to what's our core sentence. My core sentence from, that December time was that I'm alone. So I had to even think back for myself, when are the moments that I felt alone? Well, my whole life, if you want to ask my therapist. And so I remember times growing up, I grew up with 4 sisters, and I was different. I was different in the way that I viewed the world, the way that I navigated. My resiliency was different. If you know, my sisters know, so I said that. And so I was just different. So I always felt included, but alone. And no matter what, I kind of had this view because, we'll talk about growing up and they'll have these experiences and they'll refer to it as a little bit traumatic, but I'm just like, but do you remember we had ice cream? Like, we had ice cream that day. I remember the ice cream. And they're just like, what is wrong with you, Rosalyn? Is that all you remember? So again, here I am, different and alone. So then, even as I'm doing my own trauma timeline, when are the moments that I felt alone? Oh, geez, probably in every traumatic experience that I ever had, that was that core sentence. And so when you are doing your trauma timeline, you're going to find out what was your core sentence. And I'm going to give an example of a few core sentences to kind of help you along in the process as well. So some common core sentence when you're dealing with trauma are, and kind of just pay attention, see if any of these resonate with you. I'm all alone. Let me raise my hand to that one. They reject me. They leave me. I let them down. I lose everything. I fall apart. It's all my fault. They abandon me. They betray me. They humiliate me. I'll go crazy. I'll hurt my child. I'll lose my family. I'll lose control. I'll do something terrible. I'll hurt someone. I won't deserve to live. I'll be hated. I'll kill myself. They'll lock me up. They'll put me away. It'll never end. And so as you were looking at those experiences on your trauma timeline, you're going to begin to say, what's that core sentence or core belief that I have during that time? And another great example of this, because not only are you going to do this for yourself, if you have access to your parents, you're going to do this for your parents too. Because you want to find out what was their core sentence, so you can see if that in your epigenetics, is it repeating based off of what theirs is. And so you're going to begin to ask your parents or people around your parents or who may knew them, what was life like for you growing up? Okay, if I identify my core sentence, maybe I may even say, like, where are the times of life that you felt alone? Where did you feel alone at? What were those experiences? How old were you? So you're going to kind of turn into this investigator. This is kind of like the data gathering stage. Trying to understand, why am I the way that I am? But also, why are my parents the way that they are? Now, some people do not have great relationships with their parents. And that's okay. But their information is useful because even if they were a crappy parent, they still hold some keys to be able to unlock if you're going through the same traumatic experience. Now, it's recommended to be able to do this if you can, up to another generation. So if you have access to your grandparents, to be able to ask some of these questions. What was life like for you? And if my cultural background, my grandma wasn't giving no information. I could ask a lot of questions, but she still wasn't giving information. So then you find the people around them. What was it like? What was the experiences that happened? What was the traumatic experiences? Tell me the family secrets. So that then you also can do that trauma timeline to see where are the similarities. Another great example that was in the book that it didn't begin with you was Gretchen. And so Gretchen also too had wanted to die by suicide, had some suicidal ideations. And she had been to therapy for years, tried medications for years, and nothing seemed to alleviate what her depressed symptoms were. But one of the things that she said that when she wanted to die by suicide is that she wanted to be vaporized. And so her therapist is kind of like, that's a pretty, strong word. You use vaporized. But also too, the work that her brother did, said, he works in this chemical plant. And if I throw myself in one of there, I'm going to vaporize even before I hit the bottom. The therapist, being very familiar with trauma, family shared trauma, said, well, you know what, I'm just going to go out on a limb. Have you had any family members who experienced being in the Holocaust? Gretchen paused for a while and said, yes. And so if you look at that statement of what she said, vaporized, she kept using it within her sessions. And that was enough for the therapist to pick out on what was the core language. And so part of this and understanding, again, not only our own trauma, but our parents' trauma, our grandparents' trauma, we want to look and see what's the language to see, do I have that language too? Because some of the trauma may come from me, but epigenetics show that, guess what? It may come before me. This also is important culturally speaking. And so we talked a little bit about Dr. Joy DeGruy when she talked about post-traumatic slave syndrome. And I love the way that she explained it. She gives this example in the book about how she's in the bank. And while she's in the bank, there's a mother that's in front of her. And, there are two sets of mothers, one that she identified as being white, one that she identified as being of Black or Black descent. And for the one that she identified as being white, the child was able to just be freely, just kind of like play and be childlike in the bank. But the other one that she identified as Black, the mom had her hand really tight, holding her. Sit still, be quiet, don't move, don't draw attention to yourself, don't be loud. And so she began to say, let's take a look about how things can culturally be passed down. So let's think back to enslaved periods. And so here we are, we're kind of doing a cultural timeline. How would that have helped someone to survive? What happens for someone who's enslaved, who may be loud, who may be being witnessed, drawing attention to themselves? That's not going to go over so well. So then what becomes the language? Then, because, everybody didn't have access to, fancy therapists. And then what does that become when it's passed down? So then we even add this environmental perspective. So guess what? I'm going to tell my kids that you got to be quiet. You got to be still. Don't be seen. And then their kids, when they're with their kids, you got to be quiet. You got to be still. You can't be seen. And then when it's passed down to you and you're saying like, you know what, I don't know why I'm at work and I'm not being loud and I'm not, stating my truth and wanting to be seen. Oh, culturally, how has trauma passed down to me? We're in Women's History Month. Let's throw that in. Okay, culturally, let's look at some timelines. You are not supposed to work. What are you supposed to do? You're supposed to be in the home. You're supposed to be raising your kids. And then when you talk on the phone and you're talking to your mom and she says like, oh, but guess what, mom, I just got this promotion. Oh, is that going to take you away from your kids? Okay. Now I'm like, okay, well, I got this promotion. Things are going really well. But what about my kids? Even culturally, we have to look at this timeline and say, what was the shared language? Because that may be my language. That may become my trauma. And so what do we do with this after we have our trauma timeline? We have what our core sentence is. Next, we're going to do is we're going to finish the story. We're going to finish the story. And so in this, as we're doing the cultural timelines, we're going to acknowledge what the feelings were of the people who came before us. We're going to humanize them. What must this have been like? So I'll go back to my great-grandmother. She was a widow in her early 30s with 9 kids. What must that have been like? Well, then they said that her primary responsibility would have been 9 kids and focusing on that. What if she had some other goals and dreams? What if there was more that she wanted to do, but now she's having to do this alone? What must it have been like in that moment? So then taking myself and saying, how do I heal my own family trauma? I'm looking at her story and I'm saying, how do I finish my story too to help finish hers? And so there may be things that she wanted to be able to do. There's some things that I want to do too. And while I'm a widow with 2 kids, I can only imagine what it was like with 9 kids. How do I finish my story? How do I finish her story? Okay, too, let me think about the understanding that there was of grief probably back then. You push and you move through. Culturally, we see that. In different backgrounds, it's always you move through. I don't want to move through. I want to tell my story. I want to talk realistically about grief, but I also want my kids that are after me to understand how do we talk about grief? So I'm going to begin to say, what are the things that I want to see, but based on the feelings, based on that core sentence, what are the things that the generation above me would have wanted to see too, if I create what their story is. And this too is why it's that piece of saying that you don't necessarily have to have the best relationship with your parents, with your grandparents. But first, you're going to understand their trauma timeline and you're going to humanize them. Because then when you humanize them, this is how we break the generational curses. Because we look at our story and say, how do we create something that's different? Also, with that core sentence, you replace that with, what do I want my new language to be? My new language is, I am surrounded by people who love me and adore me and who appreciate my company. And so then what we're going to create this list, our old language and our new language. And what are the actions that we're currently doing? And what is it pulling us to? Is it pulling us back to our old core sentence? Or is it pulling us towards something that's new? So if I say that I don't want my language to be, I'm alone. If I say, my friends say like, hey, Rosalyn, you know what? December is this time of month for you. Let's go and do something. Let's go to get something to eat. Let's have a spa day. Let's do something. And I say, nope, I'm just going to stay at home. It's pulling me right back to that core sentence of trauma. So I got to choose something to go in this middle column that's going to pull me towards here. The other great thing too about spending time with people too, is that it's one of those things when our trauma brain is online, it fans away the flames and gives us some lovely dopamine to get this part back online. And so, have I convinced you all that you need therapy and that you are in a state of trauma and that you got to find a way to fix it? And I'm going to pause here because I know we got about 10 minutes left, but I want to be able to have some discussion to answer your questions. And also too, are there things too that resonated with you when you think about this? When you think about your experience that you're navigating, but also too, the experiences of your parents, of your grandparents, and then also culturally. And feel free to unmute your mics, talk to me.
So one thing I was thinking about, because I definitely have traumatic situations where the muscle sends it to me ahead of time. And I'm like, I just feel off. It's almost like that people feel weird with the full moon or the tides or whatever. But in your talk, I started thinking about, yeah, where are some parts where I messed up? And this explains why I've been in therapy since I was 15, right? So as I was writing those down, my parents got divorced when I was 14. And it was, I think it's traumatic, right? Like all of a sudden one day, one parent isn't living with you, right? I think it's interesting how traumatic it's just so prevalent now that it almost is this, like, I don't think people are meaning to say like, but tons of people are raised by single parents. You'll be fine, right? But there is that stress of like, one day I saw my mom struggling with the checkbook. And from then on, I never got an allowance. I went out and got a job immediately, and that's just from that. And I actually can see that image, right? Like I can see where she was. I can see the stress. I don't think she saw me. So I don't think she knows. But when I talked to her about when she lost it and we were there, or, you know, something that it was just the straw that broke the back for her that day, right? And then she collapsed and was like, you know, just at her wit's end. She gets like, it's like she relives the moment, but now with shame. So it's interesting. It's not cathartic, like from a therapy side, like I now recognize that I see it, but it's not like I get to discuss it, because all of a sudden something that's just a memory, which means something, right? You just said clearly, there's a lot of things you can forget. Well, you don't necessarily forget the things that are impactful to you, you just don't always understand them. And that's hard when it's the first emotions she says is, I'm sorry. And then you just see this wave of shame over her.
Mhm.
So then there's no way to talk about it.
And I love the language that you just used, because you said there's no way to talk about it. And I'm going to ask you that when you were 14 and that age, did anyone ask you like, hey, how are you feeling? How are you feeling about not having your allowance anymore?
No, I mean, that would be something that, I mean, I think it was convenient that when this happened, I would happen to be 15 and was eligible to work.
Mhm.
It would have been harder if I didn't have the ability to fix the solution, like if I was 12,
Mhm.
right? Because then I still would have needed a ride to the babysitter and it would have to work, you know, I mean, it would end up being a burden on her. But yeah, no, nobody talked about it. And the thing is that yeah, I mean, I think Tanya's on the call too, and in the role of teachers, like it happened 2 days before the school year ended. So then I went 4 months with no teachers. And then you kind of went to high school and it was like, they're a bigger fish to fry. You'll figure it out.
Mhm. And so then I would say too, is that language of being able to say that there weren't these parts that we could talk about. And so then even like, was that your experience of not being able to talk about it? But then also hearing your mom's response of like some shame and not being able to talk about it. Here comes like a core sentence. I can't talk about this. And then also you mentioned that piece culturally, let's add in people like, oh, it's not that big of a deal. So if it's not that big of a deal, you shouldn't feel this intensely, right? Okay, let's minimize this again. And then looking for where are the areas too in life where it's like, you know what? I can't talk about this. Where does this core sentence begin to show up on my timeline? I can't talk about this. This isn't that big of a deal, so I can't have these strong emotions, right? And then where does it repeat? Because also too, understanding a little bit about the trauma brain. And so the trauma brain, it tries to get us to survive. And so it picks up some of these coping mechanisms that are not always the best for us. So if for you, again, using that example, if this part of the trauma brain says that, you know what, I remember how bad Christy felt when she was going through this experience and not being able to talk about it, I'm probably going to try to repeat that action because I'm just going to try to normalize it because I know how hurt she was in that moment. So I'm going to keep anytime that there's some smoke, I may respond in this way to try to protect my person. And so those are those core pieces. And thank you for sharing that. And so being able to say again, like, where are those pieces? Like, you know what? Hey, I'm able to talk about this with my mom. What was her response? What was my response also back then? Are there some similarities? And does that still kind of continue? Because if so, then I got to be mindful of how does that sit and show up in my life? And I also, too, I could get on a soapbox about that. We don't talk enough about the impact of divorce on kids. That is a major traumatic experience. And especially for the brain, it becomes a marker. Because if you talk with people and you say like, hey, who did you talk to about that? No, because mom is like, oh no, I'm trying to survive. I'm trying to balance the checkbook. I don't know. And then here's the kid that's just sitting back and they're watching. And then epigenetics, because this can continuously change during life. The spacing between the lettering changes. The trauma brain comes online and says, all right, let me figure out my way how to cope. I don't care if it's just a grilled cheese that needs to be moved over. I remember the time that it was a real fire in the kitchen. So I'm going to respond like there's a real fire in the kitchen. But the great thing too about epigenetics is that it's always constantly changing. And so once we've identified these things, we can work through strategies to say, how do I fix this? And so even if we go with kind of like the body response and the muscle memory, okay, if I'm getting my signal that I'm about to flip my lid, I'm going to start doing some deep breathing. I may do the 3, 3, and 3. I may inhale for 3, hold for 3, exhale for 3. That's also going to begin to release some dopamine in my brain. And once that happens, it's going to flip my lid down. And I'm trying to make sure that I'm getting the comments. And I know Tanya, she can't unmute, but she did share too that high school teachers are the least likely to be able to support a young person. They see you for 45 minutes a day and they mistakenly, in parentheses, see that their first job is teaching content in most cases rather than teaching kids. And, you know, I love that you shared that piece too, Tanya, because as I shared before, I'm a widow. And so, but also I'm a counselor. So I thought about my kids and I thought about my teacher, the kids' teachers. Are they going to be able to come in like, okay, well, let's do this processing? No, they're not. So I gave them a cheat code. Okay, well, my kid is feeling sad that they're either going to have a sketchbook or a journal. And I'm going to need you to allow them to have some time, maybe a safe corner in the classroom so that they can go and they can write about when they're missing their dad. So do you got to come up with the plan? Nope, but I'm going to be informed enough to understand grief and trauma enough that I'm going to pass that to you. Michael also shared, I have a really hard, I try really hard in order to recognize when things are happening that bring up those old feelings of vulnerability. Yes. And so here's the piece of when you identify your smoke, you can become aware of what emotion is attached to that. So then I got to be mindful. I have to be mindful. So let's just say that I'm in, I'm playing dodgeball. I don't really play dodgeball, but let's say that I'm playing dodgeball and I don't get picked or I get picked last. I already know my core sentence will come up and say, I'm alone. Oh, I got to be careful in how I respond because it's going to bring up some of those old feelings. My trauma brain is likely going to go to that first to say, instead of saying like, Rosalyn, you don't like dodgeball, you can't even play dodgeball. So be glad you didn't get picked. It's going to go first to my smoke and says that you're alone. There's another question or no, a comment. What a great suggestion. Thanks. I have to go take care of something for my mom. Thank you, Tanya, too, for joining us. And Christy, I know that you have to run too. And I'm going to be very mindful of the time because I know that we end at 1 and you have a lot of things that are balancing. But I do encourage you. Also look for a counselor. Look for a counselor. Because this also is important, not only just for having to work through certain issues, but when things come up. And so when this thing kind of popped up and I realized like, ooh, is this my trauma or my mom's? I was able to call my therapist like, ooh, we already got this established relationship. Hey, I'm coming back. It may only be for a few sessions, but let's process through this. I don't want to process through it on my own because I don't want to be alone. And so find you a therapist that's really great, whether it's in your area. Of course, there's people doing things online as well, but find you someone that's going to help you navigate your story. Because sometimes with trauma, it's so much trauma that it can't be healed in one generation. So then it kind of comes and trickles to you to be able to help in doing some of the healing. And so I do want to just thank you all for, again, joining me. I will stay a little bit later as well if anyone else has any additional questions. But thank you to all of the amazing departments, Tony, your team, Michael, your department, and all of the others as well that invited me. I love this stuff. Feel free to invite me back for like a part 2 or something.
Well, we'll see you later on tonight at 5, right?
Yes.
Rob, you can go ahead. You want to ask your question in private, or you want to ask it now?
I could ask you now. So I was just curious. So I have a 15-year-old cousin, and she has divorced parents. She has a really bad scoliosis. She doesn't know she likes scoliosis. She's doing a lot of things, and so she tried therapy for a while, and the first experience with therapy was that it failed for her, and so she's pretty sore on the fact that there's no type of counseling that can help her. And so I'm just curious what you say to somebody like that who's pretty set on, there's nothing that can help her because of like a failed attempted therapy.
And so finding a good therapist is kind of like dating. And so, again, kind of taking it to like the 15-year-old language. Remember that boy you had a crush on, or that girl you had a crush on, in 6th grade. And then you got a little bit older and you were like, ew, like, why did I even like that person? Or it didn't feel right. And then you get a little bit older and you find someone else. You're like, you know what? I like you. You listen to me. We go on dates. You hold my hands. These are all the things that I like. Part of this is finding out what I like and what I don't like. And so sometimes in finding a therapist, we find someone that we end up not liking. Myself included. I've had therapists that I had not liked at all. And I'm like, does this mean that I should give up? Kind of want to, but no, I can't do that. This means find someone else who's better in line. And sometimes that's looking at what are their techniques that they use? How do they explain themselves with the different things? And does it resonate with me? And so part of this can be also exploring their websites, but also a lot of therapists have social media pages. And so are they on Instagram? Are they on TikTok? What are the things that are saying? And does it resonate like, oh yeah, I get it. I understand more from you. Oh, I could talk to you. You could be my therapist. And so being able to explore, and occasionally there are some people out there who aren't the best therapists. And so part of it is saying that I believe that I deserve to feel better than these feelings that I'm feeling, and that I'm going to explore and find someone who wants to sit with me on this journey.
Yeah, that's a great comparison. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Rob, I want to thank you for an excellent topic. I could go on and on about it as well. And I was going to admit earlier that it's not really any training we had in the master's program nor the doctoral program or to degree for trauma.
Yes.
Many professors I asked, they eluded the topic. It was uncomfortable for them to talk about it as well. So I congratulate you on hitting this head on, so to speak, and assisting others with training and education. So, all right, I'm going to end the recording. Again, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
And you want to call me when you get on campus?
Yes.